what I really want to talk to you about is producing a crop of honey. And most beekeepers, this is how we judge our success. And we ask each other, how did you do last year? How was it? And the answer is usually given in pounds of honey produced. But what we always want to do as well is to maintain our population of bees and to keep our stock and to have the same number of hives going into the year as you had, going into the next year as you had coming into the previous year. And it's often a struggle for beekeepers to do that and to maintain their stocks and then to encourage new people to get started. And I find that a lot of basic beekeeping sometimes is missed by very advanced lecturers who have a kind of a feeling that they forget we have beginners and we have people in the middle section that are often ignored. And I find from our own association that happens to be the case, because you judge that by the questions you're asked at lectures, and even at the cup of tea after a lecture. You're asked a very basic question, and even some of my own lectures that I give, I neglect to stick sometimes to the very basics, and that's what I will try to do. So being prepared for the honey flow, this is what we aim for all of the time. And there's never a beginning or an end to beekeeping, because it's a continuous circle. And everything you do, whatever you do one season or one time, is one season leads into the other, and what you do this season has a direct impact on the next on the next part of beekeeping, and what you did the last season has an impact on what you have now. So it's a continuous circle, and there's no beginning or no end. So preparing for the honey flow, deciding your product. Now, if you look at the honey show below, we have light, medium, dark comb. What I like to do is be prepared and have when I started beekeeping first, I did a lot of comb honey. And I did comb honey because all my equipment was new, and everything I had was new comb, new bees, new hives. And for that product, for the comb honey, you need everything clean and new. And as I progressed into beekeeping and when my equipment got older, I noticed that the quality of my comb deteriorated. But I had to go back to that again. I have to have a new comb, new supers, and new hives that keeps my product clean. For your run honey, your cut comb, your sections. And I think the cut comb and sections are often neglected a bit. And even if the shows, you see maybe 50 or 60 or 70 entries in the run honey, and you see 5 or 6 in the comb, and maybe even less in the section. So I think comb is often neglected because it's a premium product, and you really have to, it isn't that hard to do, but as we progress in beekeeping and as the years of beekeeping mount up on our apiaries, we tend to neglect it and go for run honey, because oftentimes it's handier rather than preparing your comb in advance. And sometimes the honey flow comes up on top of us that we are really, everything comes all of a sudden, and we find that we're often not fully prepared. For comb honey, you've got to prepare in advance. So everything ready on time is the main thing. I've been told this for years and years, everything ready on time. And when I started beekeeping 40 or nearly 50 years ago, this is what I was told, but I still haven't got it right. And oftentimes I'm just caught on the hop, and I never, oftentimes they're running after things instead of being ahead of them. So foundations and frames for cut comb is really what you need to do for the comb. And if you're thinking of shows, it's another thing, because if you're thinking of exhibiting it at the National Honey Show or any show, you've got to sort of think of that in the apiary and think of it at the start of your beekeeping season and have it in your mind all of the time. And when you keep it in mind, it isn't that hard to progress and know where your foundation is, know where your clean comb is, and your new comb, your new frames, and that's where you can go for your cut comb or your chunk. Section crates prepared. Again, section honey production is a different ball game. It's something you've got to do in, well prepared in advance. A good honey flow. Again, when I was a young boy, my granduncle, my grandmother's brother, had bees, and he actually made money from sections of honey. And he produced a lot of sections, and he bought himself a little farm in 1920 from sections from his beekeeping enterprise at the time. know all inspect the conditions of all equipment, and be prepared to manage swarming. This is what we need to do. Every beekeeper needs to be prepared to manage swarming, because when it does occur, you've got to be there and to know what and have a plan in mind, and to manage it rather than fight it. Because we can never fight swarming. The bees is a natural instinct that bees have, and that's to swarm. And if bees didn't swarm, we would have no bees. So it's a natural instinct, and we have got to manage it rather than to fight it. Now, as I said earlier, we measure our success in the honey produced, and it's our ability to exploit the bees' hoarding instincts. The bees have this hoarding instinct, and they're the only bee that has the hoarding instinct, the only bee that has managed to produce a crop of honey. So we exploit that, and we manage our bees to produce a crop of honey. Oftentimes, from the bees' point of view, a successful season, if I asked a colony of bees how successful they were, that would be on how many swarms they produce and how they reproduce themselves, not on the amount of honey that they gathered for the beekeeper. So their idea of a successful outcome is different to ours. We have to exploit their instinct to hoard, but they have an instinct to reproduce. Now, what we need to have is the maximum number of bees available for the honey flow. And that is our aim right through the season. And when our honey flow comes, that's when we have, we often don't know exactly when it's going to come, but we've got to be prepared. And every year it differs. With us anyway in Ireland, honey flow can come somewhere from the middle of June up to the end of July. Now, to have your bees ready for that is our main aim. But then oftentimes we don't get the middle of June to the middle of July. It could be disastrous weather, and our honey might come in after that or even before it. So we've got to have all options open, and to have your bees ready for a flow whenever it may come. And not all hives are going to be ready at the same time. And it's probably often found over the years that if you have all your hives at the same condition all of the time, it may not be the best strategy. With us anyway, because the bees that are at you're working for the maximum population of bees in middle of July, things might not be right then. The honey flow might have come earlier, or it might not have come at all. It could even be later on. So know your own area and when to expect that main honey flow. And for us now, generally it's in July. So we manage our bees for a July honey flow. And if we get a July honey flow, we have a bumper crop of honey, because we get it from the clover and the blackberry. And we still have, my granduncle was keeping bees, his crop was clover. And if I look at photographs that he took back in the 20s or 30s, every field was a sheet of white clover. And that isn't the case anymore with modern farming. Clover is really suppressed. And I often find now that our blackberry blossom and the hedgerows that are still intact, they produce a crop of honey from the blackberry blossom. But again, that again is under pressure with farming, and a farmer doesn't see a hedge as a productive element. He sees it as something in the way and taking up space. But then again, that's another thing, all these hedges and undergrowth, there's something we have to respect because of wildlife and biodiversity. So our brood must be reared in time. So you've really got to count back about 6 weeks from your main honey flow. So you're really talking about bees that are reared in early May. So that's the time that you want your queen in maximum production. And what we need to do is to keep our queens laying, to produce the maximum number of bees and the most amount of brood 6 weeks prior to our honey flow. So that's that's the massive population explosion that's within the hive at that time. So to have our bees ready for that and to have them capable of doing it. Now, it always depends on weather, it depends on food that's available, and it depends on beekeeping management. And sometimes the spring comes on us very, very suddenly. I remember years when spring, we seemed to have an endless winter. The winter went on and on and on. And our bees, we were sitting on our hands waiting for spring. But spring really never come. It ran straight into summer. And then lots of beekeepers were just caught in the hop because we thought our bees weren't progressing, but everything was progressing at a slower pace, but the bees were still building up. They were still building up a population. When they had stores there, they were using those stores to rear bees, but the cluster was tighter. It didn't seem to us they were expanding into supers, and then the weather suddenly took up and the bees were in supers, and we needed supers on straight away. And we needed all of the supers on yesterday, and we were just still preparing for 3 weeks' time. So you must always be prepared, especially in the springtime. Never assume that your bees are not progressing and are not doing the work that nature sort of, as the year goes on, the bees know what time of year it is, and they will, with proper management, they will build up. So in a situation like that, we've got to make sure that our bees have enough space and have enough food to rear this brood. If there's nothing coming in, they will need available food. So to produce a frame of brood, the bees need probably a frame of food. So if that is not coming in from a source outside, the beekeeper has to provide it, or if it's not already in the hive from the previous autumn. And I think I hear the story of Manley sometime back years ago that asked when would you do spring feeding, and he said in the autumn. So that is really, to have our bees and the least disturbance they get. And sometimes what can happen with us at times is that if you stimulate the bees abnormally in the spring with an artificial honey flow, sometimes with us they can build up too early. And for me, bees building up too early is a nuisance because I have swarming starting early. Now, oilseed rape and all that, that's a different story. I'll hit on that a little bit later. But I don't want bees too strong too early because I'm at war with them from the early May onwards, and I am fighting swarming. Now, as I said earlier, we shouldn't try to fight swarming, we should roll with it. But if I have bees that are swarming early, what can happen is that my young virgin queens don't get mated in May because May can turn into very, very bad weather. So I don't want my hives queenless in May and to try and get queens mated then, because the weather can turn very, very bad and cold and you may not get queens mated. So I prefer the swarming situation to be occurring later in the year rather than very early, because I found that this year it worked very early, it was okay. Previous year, not so good early on, but I have lost queens, especially if you're managing queens, clipped queens, and you lose a queen from a colony. And now you have a queenless colony, and the virgin queens are going to hit bad weather, and they won't mate properly. So now you're in trouble with that colony of bees that was swarming early. Now, April and May determine what they were like in July. So that's your management strategy, and they're probably the most important months of the year for beekeeping and the spring build-up. Now, to build up small stocks, we all have our bees coming into winter with, all full of hope and what we hope is vigor. But when the spring arrives, we have varying levels of varying strength of stocks. We have very, very strong, we have very, very weak, and we often have the average ones, the ones in between. And from our management point of view, we have to try and get a crop of honey from every box of bees in the apiary. And I like to manage an apiary as a unit rather than the colony as a unit. And they have to produce a crop of honey from that apiary, because when I'm bringing home my honey in end of July, early August, what I'm doing is I just, the crop of honey that comes off that apiary is what I call it as a unit, rather than the crop of honey that comes off each hive. Because we can all record a hive that has the bumper crop of honey, and we don't really tell our beekeeping friends about the others. And we take the photograph of the one that has the 4 or 5 or 6 supers on it. And the one that we were in trouble with earlier on, that's the one we ignore and tend to pass it, delete it from our own memory. But they keep the apiary as a unit. So I try to build up the small stocks, and I use the very, very strong ones to do that. And again, that controls the strong one, because you don't want that really strong stock of bees swarming with you early in the year. And if you look back through your notes, and I often find that sometimes you talk to a beekeeping association and they'll ask you what books to read. And I often say the best book you'll read is last year's notebook, because you have all of the mistakes you made there. And if you make 100 mistakes, you know 100 things that don't work. And this is what experience is. Like it's gaining from the mistakes you made and try and learning from that. And sometimes we often need to be reminded of the mistakes we are likely to make, because you're beekeeping for years, you forget. And we often, you know, sometimes you go back to basics and say, I forgot. You know, that's what I should have done, and I forgot to do it. I didn't do it. So having your queens laying all of the time is our best strategy, because a colony of bees needs to be in that sort of happy, content condition to produce a crop of honey. Now, and we call an apiary, whatever you have in your apiary, whether you have a number of apiaries or whatever, but I try to manage each apiary as a unit and not look on all of my apiaries as the one unit, but the apiary is the unit rather than the stock of bees. And to take advantage of that early flora. And the early flora for us is the willow, dandelion, blackthorn. All of that stimulates your bees. It's a natural honey flow, and it stimulates your bees to get things moving and gets the queen laying, and gets her laying in a kind of a natural progression rather than an artificial honey flow that would be, you know, what we would do if we fed our bees. So when we feed our bees, we create an artificial honey flow. It may not be the ideal time for it, because nature is often a great leveler. And sometimes we forget that our bees are, you know, they're a product of nature, and they have 20 million years advantage over us, and whatever is thrown at them, they probably have survived before. And you think of the previous lecture about Varroa, bees are going to survive, because I'm sure over 20 million years, a lot of problems came their way, and they survived. They might have had difficulties for a while, but they did survive. And so bees have, you know, we really have to respect our bees a lot, and go with them a lot of the time rather than try to fight them or to dictate to them our version of what is a good management. So you have colonies that are very strong, and they're the ones we oftentimes brag about in the spring, but if it comes to your notebook in the end of July, what was the result? And sometimes it's not what you would imagine it'd be. But we tend to brag about it, the strength of some of our colonies very early on. And then we have the very weak ones, they were the ones we don't really talk about. And we have the average ones, the ones we would like. And averages, of course, are made up of extremes. You know, we talk about weather, we talk about everything else. And if you talk about average, extremes are always included in averages. So, but what we would call an average stock of bees, I don't know, you know, those years differ again, because we have some years we would call a very strong stock of bees. For 1 year, you'd call it strong with 5 or 6 frames of brood in May. Another year, you might think it weak, because you're looking at all of the others. And but again, now I have my bees on national hives, mostly national. I have some commercial, but again, I'll talk about that as we go on to keep the queen laying and keep her occupied, fully active during the springtime to get that population of bees that you need in July. So your early flora, your dandelion. Now this is where you need to be aware that for us, the dandelion comes in the middle of April. Now, up to then, our bees are working on the stores that had overwinter. And for us, a lot of the time, it can be ivy honey. And the ivy in the springtime can be very, very hard and solid in the hives. But what can happen at times is that we have so much of it that the bees are using up that to make frames of brood. And then suddenly you get a dandelion flow. And if you have a lot of stores inside in the hive, the dandelion flow, the bees are going to start using that to produce the brood and to feed the brood. But what we forget is that we already have stores there and frames that are solid. So we need to give that queen room to lay. Now, if your queen doesn't have room to lay and dandelion nectar is coming in, or early nectar coming in, that colony is going to get congested. So we need to either take out frames of brood to manage that colony and keep that queen laying, because she will really need to expand out onto every frame of brood available frame in that brood chamber. And sometimes we have to take out frames of food and put in if we have frames of foundation. And it's always nice in your management of your bees to have frames of drawn foundation available in the springtime. Now, when I take out frames of food, some say, what do you do with them? I keep them because I often, by the end of July, I might not have one frame left because I can hit the June gap, and that is when I need to put them back in to keep the bees active, to keep the queen laying, and to keep food in the hive. So the early flora, to take advantage of that, to don't let that cause congestion, to keep frames available for the queen to lay all of the time. Now, and sometimes it can take us by surprise, and always have that space available, and then to use it to full advantage. Now, during that time of the year, your weak colonies of bees will not be progressing as they would as the strong ones, as you would expect. The average ones, oftentimes we leave them alone and they will do their own thing, but give them plenty of space. But occasionally, this very, very strong stock of bees that your experience will tell you that this is going to start swarming early. And once the swarming impulse is triggered, it doesn't stop. But it's just what you don't want this to happen. So the strong, very, very strong colonies of bees, I often use them to build up the weaker ones. Now, I have had beginners say, oh, they took frames of brood. We're often told in some of the books to put in a frame of brood into the weaker colony. But I find that a weaker colony, unless it has enough bees to incubate that brood, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of a frame of brood putting it into a weak colony that's not able to incubate it. So what I do is, oftentimes I would put on a super on top of that very strong stock with no queen excluder, with worker comb in it, and let the queen build up into it. And then once that was full of bees and brood, I would smoke the bees down, hopefully smoke the queen down, put a queen excluder in between them, check it in 4 or 5 days' time if there was eggs in it. If there's no eggs in it, the queen is in the bottom. Then that brood, that super, whether it could be a deep or a shallow, unite that with your weak colony. So now you have a frame of box of brood over your weaker colony, and the queen that brood provides this queen with young bees. She doesn't need old bees, it needs young nurse bees. So within a period of 2 or 3 weeks, you have turned that weak colony into a very, very strong one. And you have suppressed the very strong one. You kept her queen laying, and you used her to your advantage. So it's using as I said earlier, to use your resources. And your very, very strong colony is a resource that you've got, and to use that to build up your weak ones. So that, and whatever flying bees are in it, you're united in the same apiary, because it's nurse bees that are there. They're looking after the brood. And if the bees, some of the adult bees fly back to the parent stock, you don't really miss them. But you're adding brood and bees to the emerging brood and bees to that weaker stock. So that again, holds back the strong one. It gave the queen room to lay, and it built up your weak one. Now, early flora again to get comb drawn, and you could probably, when the early flora of the dandelion comes, you'll probably have a lot of oilseed rape at the same time. So to take advantage of that to build up your stocks of bees, and especially to build up the weak ones. In my area, we have oilseed rape. I really don't go for an oilseed rape crop because the Irish buying public don't necessarily like creamed honey or crystallized honey. They look for clear honey. But I would use the oilseed rape to build up stocks and to build up nukes and to produce bees, especially for beginners. Early in the year, part of your crop as well, we say managing for the honey crop, a part of your crop should also be replacement stocks of bees. If you ask any farmer especially somebody into dairying, they're always replacing stocks. They always have replacement stock coming on, and we as beekeepers have to do the same. And we've got to remember that part of our management of our operation is to produce replacements, because we are going to have losses, and we're going to have bees or queens that we want to cull and replace. So again, that's part of our management strategy as well. And to keep that queen laying, if the colony becomes congested, that queen again will be restricted in her laying. You will probably could trigger that swarming instinct earlier than you might have expected. So to keep that queen laying, to keep her flat out, as we would say at home. Now this is a blackthorn, a hedge of blackthorn in middle of April, and it's around the same time as the dandelion. And it's a good spring build-up for your bees. Not necessarily get a crop of honey off it, but it's the spring build-up. And last spring, with a very early spring, or a very good spring, and I actually did get some honey off blackthorn and dandelion. And I was congratulating myself. I had an unusual, very early crop of honey. But by the end of June, that was all gone because our June turned out so bad. But if they didn't have that, I would have had to feed bees. So I think it's better to have a natural honey rather than feed in the spring. Because you just think back to the Appomondia conference where a lot of the honey was rejected because of non-honey sugars in the honey. And would some of that be related to our feeding or related to spring feeding? So we've got to remember that in the future, you talk about spring feeding and how much do you feed and when do you feed, and with the adulteration of honey now, and the public are becoming more aware, that we would prefer a natural honey flow to build up our bees rather than building them up artificially with honey, because we really don't know what if you feed your bees a gallon of syrup and then the weather changes and the bees suddenly coming in, their nectar coming in. What they have in the brood chamber there, what would potentially have been, you would considering to feed your colony or to feed your brood to get the queen laying, the bees are going to shift that up into the supers. And you will get, if you feed in the spring, there's always the risk that you will get sugar into your supers if the weather suddenly changes and the bees shift that up, because they're moving around stores continuously. And again, as I said, if you have sealed stores in the brood chamber, to uncap some of those and get the bees to move them up, because that will give the queen room to lay. Your oilseed rape, to build up the nukes. On the oilseed rape, if you have a strong stock of bees going on to the oilseed rape, they can produce a crop of honey. But what I find with our bees go on to the oilseed rape, that suddenly we have 2 or 3 supers on the hives, and they have that full of nectar. And then if the weather changes, the bees move down, or the cluster tightens, and our honey crystallizes into supers. So again, we don't have, for me to get full advantage of a crop of honey from oilseed rape, I'd have to put on unwired comb that I could break down, because I might not always get it off before it crystallizes. But certainly to build up the nukes and build up weaker stocks. And it will stimulate the bees, so you will have a swarming situation earlier than you might have normally have expected it if you have if you're on oilseed rape where bees have access to it. So that early swarming, that will be triggered then. So but what you as a beekeeper you have to do is try and minimize that and keep the queen laying to produce bees. So what I generally try to do on oilseed rape is to give the queen full access to Dublin on national a second brood chamber, and to keep her laying and to get the honey and nectar into the supers, but keep that queen, make her produce bees, and they will produce a crop of nukes and bees for beginners and even for my own replacement. Because we have bees, we have people in the springtime looking for bees and looking for, because it's a popular thing to start beekeeping, but a lot of beekeepers locally can't get bees local. And it's up to us to produce those bees, because we don't want them coming in from abroad or coming in from elsewhere. So we want to keep our own bees in our own area, especially with diseases and spreading of diseases. I would prefer to give my neighbour who wanted to start beekeeping, I would prefer them to have bees locally rather than going 40 or 50 or 60 miles away and getting bees. So that you always have to be aware of now that incoming nectar requires space. So nectar will take up at least twice the space of the honey, because it's high in moisture and the bees need to spread it around. So when the honey flow is over, we often wonder where is it all gone? Because we had 2 supers full 2 weeks ago, and now we have only 1 super. but that all honey has been turned into all that nectar has been turned into honey, so it takes up less space. So we really have to super for the nectar that's coming in, and that again gives the bees plenty of room and plenty of the queen room to lay, so that the bees are not putting the nectar into the brood chamber and congesting the brood chamber. And get comb drawn early in the year. And I will find that oftentimes I will get comb drawn early in the year, drawn an early honey flow in preference to in June and July. So get comb drawn, especially brood comb. If you have old frames in the hive that had needed to be taken out, take them out then. Because take out before the queen lays on them and before there's brood in them. You have old empty frames, take them out and you recirculate your frames. And ideally you want to be getting your frames changed at least every 3 years or every 2 years. And I have been with some beekeepers, I think maybe in Ralph Buchler's area in Germany, where the beekeepers change their frames every year. So new comb, if you look at bees in nature, and if we can simulate what happens in nature, oftentimes we're not doing very wrong. The bees, if you take bees out of the roof of a house, there's always new comb being drawn every spring. And the bees will move on to that as the year progresses, and they'll abandon the old comb. And the wax moth and mouse will come in and destroy the old comb, and the cycle will continue like that. So the bees are always drawing comb, and they need new comb every year. And it keeps those young bees busy because it's their natural instinct to draw comb. And if we don't keep all of the bees busy in the hive and all of them working hard, they will get up to the mischief of swarming. So I will maintain is to keep them busy. So in May, this is when I was telling you, count back earlier on, like we have our main flow in July. So we count back, we give that queen space to lay. And again, there's a big demand on food. So we always have about 2 frames available for our queen to lay on. Because when you go to examine your hive, you've got to predict in your mind what it's going to be like in 2 weeks' time. And we always keep an eye on our weather forecast, what is in line weather-wise. Now, if you are in your apiary in the middle of May, and you open your hive and there is nothing there, in 2 weeks' time, what is going to be the chances? Do I have to feed? Do I have to put in a frame of food? I may have taken out frames in April to give her room to lay. Now those frames that are replaced are all full of brood and there's no food there. Do I have to put back in one of those frames? And it's always nice to keep in mind if you take a frame out of a hive, really to mark the frame with that hive number, because you like them going back in there, and not to be moving things around randomly. Now, oftentimes that doesn't work, but make your best effort to do that. So there's a big demand on food in May, and also a big demand on space for the queen to lay. So you've got to balance the two. So if you haven't got 2 frames available for the queen to lay in, there could be trouble the next time you go back there. So you have this rapid increase in population. Every full frame of brood you see, that's going to be all hatched in a few days' time, within a week. So you've got to have a space to accommodate those bees. So you've got to visualize. You may think there's not many bees there, but you have all frames of brood. So visualize what it's going to be like in 2 weeks' time when you come back to that hive. My management generally is a sort of a 2-week cycle. I don't go back to the apiary for about 2 weeks. And whatever I do in that apiary, I try and leave it right for 2 weeks' time, because I don't want driving back and forth just to accommodate to work on one hive. So to provide the space for bees and also get the bees to draw comb. Get them to draw it early. And when there's nectar coming in, bees will draw comb. If there's no nectar coming in, bees will not draw comb. So keep an eye on what the weather is going to be like. If the weather forecast is absolutely disastrous for the next week, there's no really point putting on comb, because the bees won't draw it. If you have supers, put them on, and that will relieve the congestion in the brood chamber. Oftentimes with beginners, you see they put on a frame or a box of foundation, and it doesn't really relieve the congestion because the bees don't move into it. You really need drawn comb. And as we progress our years in beekeeping is an apprenticeship. It's something you're not going to learn the first or second year. You're not going to learn it listening to people like me talking about it. You have to learn about it by doing it. And it's by practice. It's a practical subject, and as was mentioned earlier, came through an apprenticeship in carpentry, and I didn't learn it all the first year. I didn't learn it all the second year. I did an apprenticeship over 5 years. I still didn't know it all, and I still don't know it all, because I will find somebody knows something that I don't know. And it's the same in beekeeping. You will always find somebody who knows something, and you say, how on earth did I survive for so long and not know this? And it's often the way, and sometimes you may say to me, how is he in beekeeping for 40 years and still doesn't know it? May is usually the end of the early flow, and that's what happens. Then what we run into is what we often call is our June gap. And that is the time in June when there isn't anything available. And last year with us in Ireland, the June gap was very, very pronounced. We really had it. It was very, very serious, and our bees ate up anything they had in the spring. And all that early flow, the dandelion and the blackthorn I was bragging about earlier on, the bees needed all that to survive the June gap. Now, if I had taken off honey, as some people had, I would have had to feed bees. And what was going to happen to the sugar I put onto the bees? Sometimes, you have to think about that. What we get sometimes is our hawthorn produces a crop of honey. And in the last few years, we got, nice little bit of honey from the hawthorn. Last year I got a bit, but it's only about once every 4 or 5 years that we'll get what we call a significant crop of hawthorn honey. But there's fantastic blossom on it, and really nice to see the bees working it. Again, an early source of nectar. It's finished by the end of May, and it's the Mayflower. So we work our bees for that. If you have a population of bees that's fit to get it, that's great. But generally, we can't rely on it. It's a very fickle crop. So into June, the early flow finishes, and the June gap, and the foragers are unemployed. And now what happens, we get sort of natural congestion and cabin fever within our hive, and this is when swarming is going to start. And as I said earlier on, always have to make sure there is the 2 frames or that queen to lay, but also that there is food there available to them. Swarming in that time of the year, oftentimes you can deal with it, that you don't decrease the population within your colony too drastically. If you let your bees go on natural, swarm naturally, you're going to lose bees. And if we lose our bees onto a bush, onto a tree, they are gone. And that stock of bees has, from the bees' point of view, they've been successful, they've reproduced themselves, and they've sent a swarm out into the wild. But from the beekeeper's point of view, we have lost our crop of honey. So what we want to do is to take control of it, and we cannot fight it. Now, this is when you discover whether you're prepared or not. When all our equipment is used up, and we have to go making up frames and getting supers ready, it's really not the time to be doing it. You've got to have it ready, available to you at that stage. So this is where you say, I should have done this 2 weeks ago. I should have done this 2 months ago. I should have had all my supers ready to go. And it's not then that you try and get your neighbour, your friend, you put wax in some frames for me. So you really have to be ready. Now the main flow can start at the end of the month. Again, you've got to be ready for that. So this is what you have to try. This is the conundrum beekeepers always come up with. How do I maintain that population of bees and to control swarming? And every year I tell myself, I'm going to get it right this year. I never succeeded. It's always a problem. But then again, is swarming a problem? We got to roll with it, and it's going to be there. To talk to you about swarm control and how I manage my bees, this is probably another, it's another lecture, and I probably won't have time to go into that. But what I'm trying to do is to give you a general overall view of what you need to be doing and what you need to learn and what you need to find out. Because beekeeping is such a vast subject. I could talk to you here for another hour and still not cover it all. And I'm kind of looking at my own time. I've only 15 minutes left, and I wonder, have I started yet? Or have I even given you, any idea of how to prepare your bees for the honey crop? But I suppose that will stimulate you to come back into the next lecture, and by the end of the 3 or 4 days, you might have an idea what to do. So bees, remember that bees always work best in this happy condition when the queen is laying and everything is normal within the hive. And you have young bees hatching, and they're keeping the population up, because when bees are working for in a honey flow, you have a big attrition, you have a big lot of bees dying off, because in May you have the queen laying maybe 1,500 eggs a day, and you have 1,500 bees a day hatching in that colony, and that's when you need that space. And if you have 1,500 bees hatching every day and there's nothing going on, the bees aren't dying off, they aren't working a honey flow. This is when you're going to get massive congestion. So you have to accommodate, all of these things. There's never 2 years the same. I'm beekeeping forever, and I never find 2 years the same. I can never replicate exactly what I did last year, because it may not work. I cannot tell somebody, sometimes I tell beginners, oh, you do this in the middle of June. And they will come to you then the next year, oh, it's the middle of June, now will I do it? And you scratch your head and you say, maybe not, maybe in 3 weeks' time. Like the middle of June last year could be early July this year. So, every year differs. And what we try to do in the summer, keep it, unnecessary manipulation to a minimum. And now, they sort of instinctively know if a colony of bees is going to swarm, or if it's going to need, when you take off the roof, lift off the supers, you feel what's in them, and you go down into the brood chamber. I find that early in May or that time of year, a single national brood chamber isn't enough room for the queen to lay. So I would either need a double or at least 1.5. And it depends on your bee again, if you have a prolific bee. But I find that a national brood chamber for my operation isn't enough. I need at least 1.5. And that keeps that queen laying. If I have her in a single brood chamber, I'm going to get swarming early on. So I want to keep her laying and to have the swarming impulse delayed for as long as possible. And if it's delayed until the major honey flow starts, oftentimes the bees abandon the swarming idea altogether until it's over, because sometimes you go back to a hive and you find queen cells are torn down. Now, if you go to your colony of bees and you notice there's no comb being built, and you notice a hive beside it actually drawing comb, the bees that are not drawing the comb, they might have a swarming instinct or a swarming impulse. If there's brood hatching on the outside frames, and especially drone brood, if there's brood hatching and the queen is not replacing those, replacing eggs in those cells that have hatched. If I go to open my hive and I take out the end frames and there's drone brood there and I see eggs back in there, I'm kind of happy that this hive is not intending to swarm. But if I find that their brood haven't hatched and the queen is not replacing those eggs, then swarming is somewhere down the line. So if I go to my apiary and there's 1 or 2 hives swarming, and a lot of them are the same strength, I assume that in 3 or 4 days' time, the others are going to be on the swarming line as well. So I treat all that apiary, if I can, in the same way. So I will assume that these hives are going to swarm. And what I will do is I'll make up an artificial swarm. Now I'll talk about that, a little bit about that later on. So the indication is there's no comb being drawn, and there's a little bit less work going on. No eggs replacing hatching brood. Now, just taking down queen cells is usually a waste of time. It frustrates the bees. It doesn't work. You may try it if there's a honey flow imminent, the weather says everything is great, and the temperature is going to be fantastic next week, and the weather is good, and the flow is there. Then I may break down the queen cells, because the bees, if the honey flow arrives, the bees may start gathering in the nectar, and every available bee will be out flying, gathering in nectar, and they may forget about swarming. But usually, when I see queen cells, that is the time I act. Because if I see the queen and there are queen cells started, if I don't take out that queen, I won't see her anymore. She's gone. And my hives, they have clipped and marked queens. Now, there have been years when my best queen was last year's queen. And I never like losing a queen that was good, that produced a population of bees. And if she's last year's queen, she is still good for next year. And I find that this year, my best queens that I have now are last year's queens, not the queens that were mated this year. The queens that were mated this year, I'm a little bit, weather was bad. Are they going to turn into drone layers in the spring? But the queen that was mated last year, I'm dead sure she's good. So I don't like losing queens early in the year, and because they might be the best queens I have. And bees will swarm in spite of you. If you start fighting with them, they will swarm. And there's going to be a queen cell somewhere. You have a massive population of bees. There is a queen cell somewhere in there that you will miss. And, you know, you want to... so remove the old queen in that nuke, or you probably won't see her again. Because I remove that queen and I keep her. And oftentimes she's the best queen I have. And I remove the sealed queen cells. And check for those concealed ones that are in the corners of the frames, especially if you have older comb and the bees eat holes in it and there's gaps there, that's where they're going to be in. And that was like what I said earlier, to keep your combs and everything as new as possible. And there are probably less little cavities in there for the bees to hide polished for the queen cells. And select a well-provisioned open queen cell and note its position. Now, how I said earlier, I break down, if there are sealed cells there, I take them down. If the queen is still there. If there are sealed cells, you really want to check for the queen, because the queen may not be there. Now, this is what we call a well-provisioned queen cell. On the face of the comb, you look up into that, you'll see the larva in there. And then you come back, just about to be sealed. And you know this cell now is going to be sealed today or tomorrow. So in 6 days' time, there's going to be a queen hatching here. So you've got to get back. If you leave sealed queen cells, you've got to get back there before any of those cells hatch, or you've been wasting your time. If those cells hatch, you have you've lost control of the situation, because there may be several virgins there. And if you have several virgins in a colony at the same time, you've lost control, because you don't know what's going to happen. And you may finish up with a queenless stock of bees. So you select that cell and you leave it, you mark where it is. You go back in about 4 or 5 days' time and take down every other cell and leave that one there. Now, if you don't take, if you miss that, that's why I say, and manage an apiary as a unit. I will have several hives in that apiary that have to do the same manipulation too, because I don't want to be going back there. So I will have started, if I took out a queen cell, the queens will have started emergency cells in the hive where I took out the queen if they hadn't normally cells. So those emergency cells, I will take them out and leave them with a younger larva, so that I can attend to several hives. I'm not going back to one hive just to do one thing. I can be attending to several hives at the same time. So instead of waiting for them to swarm naturally, I get ahead of them a little bit. And this is when I can re-queen some stocks from queens that I don't particularly like. I can give them a frame of brood from a hive that I like and get them to rare queens from what I would consider my best hives of bees. Now, sometimes I definitely take temperament and docility into that situation, because working bees that are cross is no fun. And I try, in the last 40 years of beekeeping, every year I've been trying to improve the temperament of my bees, and to a large extent have succeeded. That I can work my bees with pleasure and they are not a danger or a nuisance to the neighbours. Leave all other open cells. 6 days later, check your cell is sealed, and if that one everything looks good, break down all the others and check thoroughly for the hidden cells, and check after a few days that that cell has hatched. And when you see this capping, this is a cell that has hatched. Now, always be aware that the queen can cut the little tip of that cell open, and the lid will be sealed back in again by the bees. A worker bee will run up there, and you will go back, you think your cell hasn't hatched, but it actually has hatched. And you just tip the top of it. You think it should have hatched, tip the top of it with your finger, and you'll see the lid will open up. The queen has gone, but there's a worker entombed in there. Our main honey flow, our blackberry blossom, our clover, bee flying in that, and you find that clover falls down. Oftentimes that type of clover I find is not as good as that's clover in after grass. I find it's not as good as the clover that's in grazing land where you have sheep or cattle grazing. As you come on towards the end of the year, we have our rose bay willow herb. I have got, you know, in the year past, I've got crops of honey or nice bit of honey from a rose bay willow herb, and that's usually the end of July running into early August. And heather honey again, the end of July, early August. We get bell heather from end of July. In my area, I don't really get bell heather, but I can get the ling in early August. And I find that the bees that I work best on ling are those queens that I took out from early in the year. If I take my queen out and I put that into a nuke and build that up. So that is the stock of bees that I work for heather, because it has built up and it's reaching its peak, it's reaching its maximum population for the heather flow. Or young queens, nukes that I made up with young queens in early June. They again they're the ones that are sort of managed for the heather. The bees that have produced a crop of honey from the summer crop are not the bees that will produce the late crop, because they have completed their cycle, and you'll find that they have reached their peak and they're on their way down at that time of year. Whereas the other ones, they peak that little bit later, and they are peaking for the heather crop at the end of July or early August. So that is, you know, that's when the young queens reach their peak. And again, for the heather supers with unwired foundation or starters, because our heather honey is Tixotropic, it's a comb honey. It's a fantastic comb honey, and if you get it in comb, there's really nothing like it. You know, for the public, like heather, I find that selling comb heather honey is more successful than selling heather honey in jars, because people, I find, the buying public like heather honey and comb rather than in the. I find that sometimes they make if they don't. The buying public tend to buy what they bought last week and tend to buy what they bought the week before. But if the advantage of field days, open days, agriculture shows is where you can get the public to taste the other products that they don't generally buy in the shop. And that is how we educate people into different types of honey and heather, and maybe what from our own situation now is ivy. And I'm finding we often tended to say ivy honey wasn't a crop of honey, that it was just winter feed for the bees and a nuisance honey. But I'm finding in the last few years, when you've tried it with the public, what the beekeeper may not like, a lot of the public actually do like it. And take off the heather before the ivy starts, because we often tended to think of ivy as not a crop of honey, but ivy actually is a crop of honey, and we should be able to work it. So that again, Roger, finished on time. You warned me.
John, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
You talked about making a crop stronger, or making a colony stronger by adding a second brood box onto a strong colony, and then when it's ready, you move it to the weaker colony.
Yeah.
What I wasn't clear about was, do you leave the bees, or do you try and take some of the bees with you?
I take bees with me.
You take the bees as well?
Yeah, because the weaker colony won't have enough bees to incubate the brood.
So what stops the bees being attacked when they get moved to another colony?
I unite them, as a uniting piece of paper between them.
Ah, okay, yeah. Thank you.
So probably, that's probably, that line goes in on the next lecture.
Have to come back, but
because every time I do a talk, there's always something I neglect, but I unite them as a united unit. And sometimes I actually have done a very strong stock of bees, take out some frames from the brood chamber, put them into a nuke, and unite a nuke, and unite two nukes together. Unite a queenless nuke and a queen-right nuke. Unite them into a brood chamber with paper between them, and that turns into a full stock of bees. So I never recommend people to take frames of brood and add them to a stock of bees, because they don't. You will lose the frame of brood because the bees aren't. You haven't enough bees in the parent stock to incubate it, because the temperature varies. You may get like ideal temperatures one day, and the next day, in 2 or 3 days, the temperature could literally drop by 10 degrees. So you don't know what to know. Bring bees to look after the brood.
You'd mentioned about maximising the number of forages in July, and then that process started in May. If you were going to use something like a shook swarm to replace your comb and help with varroa management, when would you be thinking of doing that, just being mindful of that impact on future foragers?
So you're saying to take a shook swarm instead of...
It's just if you use something like a shook swarm as a means of changing comb and also helping with varroa management.
Yeah.
When would you might think of doing that, being mindful of how that might impact the forager numbers in July?
Yeah, to take a shook swarm instead of... I generally don't do shook swarms. I tend to keep brood and bees together. Now, to take a shook swarm from a stock of bees, I would find, might deplete it of bees to look after brood, because if I ever did something like that, I'm always aware of the fact that I can leave the brood vulnerable. And I tend to keep, when I'm, from the management of varroa point of view, I don't use shook swarms or anything to manage varroa. I manage varroa conventionally and simply by treating in the autumn with one of our proprietary products, rather than trying to manage varroa. Maybe I should be managing varroa more naturally in shook swarm situations. Maybe you think of treating the shook swarm instead of treating a colony. But no, I don't do when I'm equalizing bees or managing bees. Somebody did mention to me one time, would I not just swap the colonies around to give a strong one some bees? But they're not the bees I need to give it. I need to give it young bees, and I need to give it brood. I don't need to give it adult bees. So, you know, and then again, I might denude the donor colony of nurse bees and of, not really nurse bees, but incubating bees to keep the brood warm. I'm always aware of that in our climate, of chilling brood and depleting a colony of bees like that.
Perhaps you can shed some light on the following scenario. Say you have 2 supers that are starting to fill with young honey. It might even be starting to be capped, and you want to add more supers. Would you super on top with your drawn comb, or would you super below, and why?
Yeah. I often would like to know the answer to that. Again, it depends. It totally depends on whether, if I found that the bees were getting congested and that they were appearing to be congested, I would super on the bottom. But if I thought to myself, like, whether it was in 2 minds or not, if I said, really, do I need to put a super on here or do I not? I'd put it on top. And if I thought to myself, oh, these really need a super, I'd put it on the bottom. So it depends on my frame of mind at the time. If I had a very bad forecast, and I heard the forecast in the morning, and they were giving Atlantic fronts coming in, and wind, I would super on top. If I heard the forecast 25 degrees for the next week, forage was there, I'd super on the bottom.
Do you use oxalic acid in December or January to combat varroa?
I do. Short answer.
How do you do it? Drip it, or do you use the vapour?
Vapour.
Okay.
I hope that answers.
That's great. So I think that, we've got one gentleman over here on the right.
I always do get a spring crop. I have occasionally fed in anticipation to build them up, but only very little as a sort of indication to get the queen going. What would your recommendation be? And I'm feeling you're being very charitable. Your comment, Apimodia, to suggest it's contamination due to spring feeding.
Generally, when I'm, to stimulate bees in the spring, or to, if you're running short of, the bees are oftentimes, and there have been years when I have fed more in the springtime and early summer than I have during the winter to keep bees alive. And you've got to keep your bees alive, I'll feed them. But generally I try to steer away from that and manage my bees in the spring that I don't have to feed them. But if I have to feed bees and the year turns out that way, if I need to feed bees, I will feed the bees, because the dead bees won't get me any honey. So, I will feed, and you probably said me I was charitable about the contamination. That's a different story, a different day's work, and probably would be hearing a lot more about that. But I would always indicate to beekeepers that we want to produce our honey and have it as pure as possible, to be aware of the fact that it can happen. If you have it in mind, and when you're feeding bees, feed just enough to keep them going, but that adds to your work. Sometimes people in the spring will feed a gallon of syrup, and then the weather changes. But I thought to myself, if I heard this guy fed a gallon of syrup back a week ago, and then the weather just switched, the honey flow came on, and that was in the brood chamber. This queen needs to lay, rather than a trickle feed as a nectar flow would be, a little bit coming in all along. Suddenly we give them all this honey, or all this syrup is all in the brood chamber. That's where they've put it. And then as the queen lays out, where did they put it? If they don't use it up, where does it go? That's just a question I ask myself. And I would like other beekeepers to ask themselves the same question, just to be aware of that.
Could you explain how you would merge two nukes?
How do I unite two nukes? If I have I could unite two nukes just generally with newspaper between them. But what I have often done is unite two nukes into a brood chamber, and to put them side by side for a day or two. And then put one nuke into the brood chamber with the queen, cover her with paper, put the other nuke in beside it, and have a separate entrance. And they will merge together in about 2 weeks' time. The queen will be laying on, if you have a queenless nuke with a lot of brood, a queen right nuke maybe has a small patch of brood, and in 2 weeks' time the queen will be laying on practically every frame there. The frame of brood, the 2 frames of brood will have hatched. So you will have a good strong stock of bees maybe ready for a super within 2 or 3 weeks, rather than sitting on a nuke that was never going to be any good. The hive you took them from will have 2 or 3 extra frames for the queen to lay on, and they won't even miss the brood. So I could unite it normally with one box on top of the other with newspaper between them, or side by side with newspaper between them.
Yeah, you talked about increasing room for the queen to lay by adding frames of drawn comb. And we've all seen those diagrams in the books about, if the brood is this shape, where you add the frames. Are you particular about where you add them? Do you put them in the middle? Do you divide the brood area, or do you put the new combs around the edge?
Generally, I put if I wanted a queen, if there was no prospect of nectar coming in, I wouldn't put in that frame of brood or that frame of foundation, because they won't draw it. But if there's nectar coming in, or if I was maybe going to feed bees, I would put in a frame of foundation inside the pollen barrier, outside the brood area. So inside the pollen frame, but outside of the brood. I don't split the brood generally in the springtime. Now, if there was nectar coming in the middle of the summer and everything was going well, I would have no problem putting a frame of foundation into the center of the brood nest. But if the weather did break, what would happen is you would have the queen one side, you'd have brood the other side. And what happens is the queen won't pass the frame of foundation, and you will get her congested. If there's nectar coming in, you could put it into the center, but generally I put it once just outside of the brood nest, inside of the pollen frame.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you particularly to our wonderful, fascinating Mr. John Donoghue.